Hi, and welcome back to Dispelling the Myths with Ish. For today's lesson, we're dispelling the myth of male sapien women's victimhood. It is sometimes toted that female male sapiens were equal victims of their male counterparts during chattel slavery. Woo! So what's the truth? According to the White House Historical Association, Yale, the African American Intellectual History Society, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Cambridge.org, Oxford, and my personal favorite, They Were Her Property, by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. It is estimated that 40% of slave owners may have been white women. Most Americans know that George Washington owned enslaved people at his Mount Vernon home, but fewer probably know that it was his wife Martha who dramatically increased the enslaved population there. When they wed in 1759, George owned around 18 people. Martha, one of the richest women in Virginia, owned 84. The high number of people Martha Washington owned is unusual, but the fact that she owned them is not. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, a history professor at the University of California, Berkeley, has compiled data on just how many white women owned slaves in the U.S., and in parts of the 1850 and 1860 census data, she studied that white women make up 40% of all slave owners. Slaveholding parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, says Jones Rogers. What this means is that their very identities as white Southern women were tied to the actual or the possible ownership of other people. In fact, white women were active and violent participants in the slave market. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved people in whom they had vested economic interest. Owning a large number of enslaved people made a woman a better marriage prospect. Once married, white women fought in courts to preserve their legal ownership over enslaved people as opposed to their husband's ownership, and often won. For them, slavery was their freedom. Their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they're little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts. Citing interviews with formerly enslaved people that the Works Progress Administration, a New Deal agency, conducted in the 1930s, Jones Rogers shows that part of white children's training in plantation management involved beating enslaved people. It didn't matter whether the child was large or small, one woman told the WPA, they'll always beat you till the blood ran down. As adults, white women often tore black women away from their babies so they could nurse the white mistress's baby instead. To this end, white women placed thousands of advertisements in newspapers looking for enslaved wet nurses to feed their own children and created a huge market for enslaved black women who had recently given birth. Why did these women want black women to nurse their children? One complained, she felt like continuously having children and continuously nursing her children made her a slave to her children. That's an actual quote. So y'all was just bathing in the blood of our ancestors with your men, huh? Tell me again how you were victims? Girl, please.